Welcome to Hiraeth, the home of modern Welsh politics. The coronavirus pandemic has meant that fewer of us are engaging on our usual daily commute. But with the vaccination process in full flow, how long will it be before the Welsh masses are back on the move? And as manifestos are written, will calls for relief roads become louder? Or will active travel, new bus networks and Wales's newly nationalised rail network win the peace? Joining me and Kerry this evening are Stuart Cole, Professor of Transport at the University of South Wales. Hello, Stuart.
Hello, Matt.
We have Christine Boston, Director of Sustrans Cymru. Hello, Christine.
Hi, good evening.
We've got John Pockett, former Director for Wales of the Confederation of Passenger Transport, which is the professional trade association of the bus and coach industry, for over 20 years until his retirement at the end of 2020. So hello, John.
Hi there, Matt.
Lovely to have you all here with us this evening. So before we look to the future, we want to reflect a bit on the past. We've had 22 years, give or take, of devolved government in Wales. How have the Welsh Government dealt with transport since 1999? And are there any highlights or lowlights you'd like to mention? We'll start off with Stuart.
Well, I think the problem or the challenge the Welsh Government have had in its first 20 years as a government, as opposed to a Department of State of the United Kingdom, is that it had to, first of all, understand exactly what it was going to do and what it had powers over. And what it has at the moment are a substantial number of powers over main roads, over traffic in general in local authority areas, working with the local authorities. It has responsibility for funding buses and trains in Wales in terms of subsidy. What it doesn't have is a responsibility for the infrastructure on the railway, nor indeed bus regulation, both of which are essential if it is to create the integrated transport policy that it says it wants.
Another thing, I think, Stuart, the problem the government had, certainly at the beginning, was that they didn't know what to do with transport. It was attached to this, it was attached to that, it was attached to something else. I remember trying to get a group of people together, probably as early as about 2004, road haulage and all that sort of thing, and other road users, to try and lobby for at least a deputy minister. But the message came back clearly from the government: join the queue, there are far more what they saw as deserving causes to get their own deputy minister. I mean, we have one now, which is good, and it does show that transport is very much further up the agenda. But I think it backs up what you say, I think, in a way, Stuart, was that they didn't know what to do. It was, first of all, I can't remember, it was with planning, wasn't it? Then for a time it was with local government, then it was with something else. But it's been with economy and that now, with its own deputy minister, which I think is encouraging for the sector.
I think, of course, Stuart and John are absolutely right about powers. You know, things like permits and licensing, for example, still are not devolved. So that creates some challenges, that I know well through my previous role with Community Transport Association, for example. But, there have been some positives, haven't there, over the last 20 years? So from a perspective of active travel, we've seen increased investment for active travel routes. The draft budget for this coming financial year has seen the highest investment yet for active travel in Wales. So that's £55 million investment, 20 million more than last year, and it amounts to £17.50 per head, which compares really well to other nations. So, Welsh Government is sort of trying to make some bold commitments, I think. They've, of course, made the decision not to take forward the M4 relief road, and they're looking, or they formed the Burns Commission to look at the alternatives. And I think part of that, is in response to their declaration of a climate emergency. They're starting to realise and show that we can't continue building new roads, and we have to, put our money somewhere else. They have created Transport for Wales, which I think is a really clear commitment of their desire to build a sustainable and inclusive transport network. And that's really positive. And they've recently been consulting on a draft transport strategy, which I think is fitting for the next 25 years. They've really put people at the heart of that, and sustainability at the heart of that. And that is what we're going to need now going forward.
You mentioned the M4 relief road there, Christine, and it's an area we don't really want to spend a lot of time on tonight, but it is going to be, we think, a big ticket item in the election. What do you think? Has the Welsh Government made the right decision on its approach to the M4 relief road?
We've seen, haven't we, devastation caused by flooding. Just looking at the last 12 months, it's been devastating for lots of communities, plenty of them on high alert, being evacuated from their homes. This is only going to get worse. If you look at carbon emissions, whilst overall they have reduced in Wales over the last 20 years, for transport they've remained largely static. It's not the right message to build an M4 relief road. We need to look at the alternatives. We need to ensure that there's a good sustainable transport network, that transport is integrated with active travel, and that people can get around in a more sustainable way.
I think whatever anybody thinks from a transport point of view, from a Parkinson's law point of view, I mean, the space will fill, what does it say now? More space, the more you'll get filling it. And I think Stuart, and probably Christine as well, would know better than me, the greater volume of traffic around Newport is comparatively local then. So if you could resolve the use of somebody jumping in their car and going from High Cross to Riga Park, a lot of the problems would be alleviated. I'm not saying they would be resolved. I think they would be alleviated if you could get people out of their cars for local journeys. And I think that's not just around the M4. That's in other places. That's certainly around Cardiff. It's around the metropolis here of Pontypridd, and it's probably everywhere else.
The decision was undoubtedly the right one, and the decision has been made 3 times. That new motorway has been rejected by 3 separate cabinets over the last 15 years. It wasn't such a good idea that it was brought back as a possibility. There are a number of reasons that have been suggested how it managed to get back in to the top end of the political discussion, but it did. It was quite clear that the Minister for Finance under Cameron Jones had decided that the funding wasn't available, and fortunately he became First Minister, which meant that the decision was made. John's absolutely right when he says that as you expand road capacity, so the numbers of vehicles will increase. I can quote a book called Travel in Towns by Dr. Martin Mogridge. The late Dr. Mogridge made it quite clear in his book, written in the 1960s, that that's exactly what would happen, and that's indeed what did happen. There are questions about that road, whether it should have been built, whether it should have been a new M4, or as I was asked to do by the Institution of Welsh Affairs, or ironically, I suppose, the chief exec at the time, or the director at the time of the IWA was one Lee Waters. I'm quite sure he totally agreed with the decision to close the whole operation. There was an alternative I was asked to write about, which was upgrading the A48 south of Newport. I was asked what would be my alternative road, rather than the question that was asked of the South East Wales Transport Commission, which I would have preferred to have been asked, which was what can we do instead of an M4 motorway? The lesser of the 2 evils was to upgrade the A48, a dual carriageway road, runs to the south of Newport, a whole heap of traffic lights and roundabouts, which make it almost impossible to use as a through route. But converting those into flyovers, the plans were drawn up by the Welsh Government, and it could have been done. But the question now remains, should it have been done, or is what came out from the South East Wales Transport Commission a series of additional railway stations of good park and ride or walk and ride to those railway stations to attract that traffic which is destined for the centre of Newport and the centre of Cardiff, away from the M4 and onto the rail network. And let's remember, some of that traffic comes from over the border in England. So there are stations the other side of the border, the other side of the Severn, which again feed into Cardiff and feed into South Wales. And the improvements in the network frequency of services between Cardiff and Bristol is also going to be a part of this, as well as the stations that are being built or proposed to be built by the Commission this side of the Severn.
Obviously, one of the great disappointments was on behalf of the freight and road haulage industry about the new M4. In a way, it's sad. Obviously, we've seen that numbers of lorries coming from Ireland and travelling back and forth to Ireland. Maybe it is teething problems. I don't think it is myself. because they are going directly from the Republic of Ireland down to the continent, France mainly now. But is that going to have a relevant effect in that Welsh haulage industry was up in arms about it? Is that going to have much of an effect on it, the fact that there isn't the same amount of freight and haulage travel?
I think you have to take into account the percentage of the traffic on the M4, particularly in South East Wales, that's cars and how much of it is heavy goods vehicles. If you look at what's happening currently on the M4, a large part of the car traffic has disappeared because of furlough, because the schools are closed. Consequently, the number of lorries, although the big complaint from most car drivers is, oh, it's those lorries, they get in the way. They just happen to be very large individually, but they only constitute something like 15% of the total traffic on that section of the M4. Now, you raise a very important question, John, in terms of what will happen to the Irish traffic. It's become quite clear that the Irish freight forwarders and hauliers who are responsible for moving goods into Ireland and out of Ireland have seen what's happening at Dover, and whatever the likes of Mr. Gove might say, that problem continues with the kind of paperwork, even if there isn't a physical delay, but there will be physical delay continuing and the paperwork will become impossible, as many companies have said. That means that the European Union policy of trying to take lorries off the road and put onto the sea will now have an incentive for those operators. I worked on the Motorways of the Sea, as it's called, project 12 years ago now, I suppose. And the big hindrance to that kind of movement from road to sea was the fact that most hauliers, most freight forwarders thought, we know the route we've got, it's an easy route, we'll use the Welsh and English land bridge to get down to Dover and over to the mainland. It's easy. But when they were forced to think about it in the last few months, the movement over to direct shipping from places like Dunleary and from the other ports in Ireland over to Roscoff, over to Cherbourg, over to Rotterdam, it might actually take a bit longer. The journey time, for example, to Calais from Dublin was around 10 hours. The route directly takes about 16 to 18 hours, depending on which port. But of course, not everybody wants to go to Calais. There's an awful lot of traffic which is destined for parts of northern France and elsewhere, and indeed to Spain. So the European Union are very enthused, and the Commission in particular, that the work that they had done 10, 12 years ago can now possibly be put into effect to achieve the kind of objectives that Christine was mentioning earlier, the climate change objectives of removing those lorries from roads, not only in Wales and England, but also from large parts of northern France, from central France, who complained about traffic coming from Spain. Now, moving that traffic onto the sea crossings also saves a lot of money in terms of drivers' hours. What you might think, because surely somebody has to drive those wagons, but they don't when they're on the ships. Those are what are called unaccompanied trailers. And the trailer units are put onto the ships in the Irish ports or the French ports and sent by sea unaccompanied and picked up then by another set of drivers and tractor units at the far end. So there are savings to be made, and there is now an incentive in terms of paperwork, in terms of free flow of goods between the Irish Republic and indeed Northern Ireland and the mainland of the European Union. So I think there are many reasons why we will find that Mrs. Nolan and others will no longer be sending their lorries along the M4 or the A55, but more likely to be sending them directly to Cherbourg. Consequently, a reduction in the number of lorries, which we will see on both the M4 and the A55.
We've talked a lot about sort of transport between towns and cities and between England and Wales. What do you think about rural transport? Has the Welsh Government done enough for rural communities and connecting them and allowing people who live in those areas to get to other economic hubs?
I have to declare an interest as the person who created Sustrans Cymru, the government's long-distance bus operation. That was brought in 2010 We started the work on it in 2008. In answering the Welsh Government's question, what do we do about rural public transport? We've got to provide it in some way, but it is costing more and more money every year. And two things developed from that. One was Sustrans Cymru, which dealt with those longer distance journeys, which covered what was probably the old rail network in Wales. Carmarthen, Aberystwyth, Barmouth, Machynlleth, Dolgellau, up to Wrexham, Bangor down to Aberystwyth, and down the west coast to Haverfordwest from Aberystwyth, and then up the eastern borders from Cardiff to Brecon to Llandrindod and Newtown. Now, those were the key networks, which some were previously rail, some weren't. But they were the areas where we identified that there was a demand for people to make those longer distance journeys. And I think that risk, which the Welsh Government took at the time, it has paid off, because the numbers of people carried on that operation is now well over 4 million people, which for a bus operation is very high. So we've got that. We've got developments such as Bookabus in rural Wales, and now Flexibus, which has come up, Flexi rather, which has come up more recently. Now, those are the kinds of developments which suit a sparsely populated area, so long as they're integrated. And I think that's the essential element. Feeder buses into the longer distance vehicles, enabling people to make more substantial journeys to the bigger settlements in Wales, like Aberystwyth, like Haverfordwest, Bangor, Wrexham, Cardiff, Swansea, and so on. So those kinds of developments, I think, are the way in which we're going forward. We're unlikely, sadly, to have substantial rail investment in those areas at the moment. I would love to see the reopening of the railway from Bangor, Carnarvon, Afon Wen, down to Aberystwyth, and then a new railway from Aberystwyth to Carmarthen, but not along the route which is being proposed currently. That route has very few people living in it. There is a possibility. A number of other countries in Europe have done it. So we're not a long way away from doing that. But at the moment, I think we have to be financially realistic and see what is affordable in terms of those kinds of rural developments. But the bus undoubtedly is the only means of longer distance rural transport. We have the Heart of Wales line, we have the Cambrian line. They do operate and they carry a lot of people. But I think the bus has that flexibility which can match the very widespread and sparsely populated parts of Wales, and that undoubtedly is the biggest chunk geographically of Wales.
It's clear that demand responsive transport is the answer for rural areas, demand responsive bus. So the Flexi pilot is interesting. That is operating at the minute across Wales. Community transport, of course, is a major part of the solution for many rural communities. I think it's very clear that for rural transport especially, it's a very, very local issue, and transport needs to be planned around the needs of those communities. And that's what community transport does best, transport solutions from the ground up, delivered by the community for the community, and those solutions work well. The community transport strategy that exists at the minute has been in place for 20 years and hasn't been updated, but there are plans to do that. I think the new transport strategy, Llwybr Niwedd, is very strong on community transport and looking to put a plan in place for that. So I think that's a really good move. I would say more could be done around connecting rural communities via the National Cycle Network, and that's often overlooked. There's obviously, always lots of pushback around rural communities and, the landscape and the challenges for active travel. But actually, there are communities where there are good cycle links. E-bikes are becoming more and more popular, and they are a game changer for those types of areas. So, I think we need to think differently about strategic cycle routes for rural communities as well, just to make sure we're bringing in every option for those communities.
I think the solutions in rural areas are going to be very different to urban areas, and I think very often politicians don't see that. They think one size fits all, and certainly what works in Cardiff or works in in the northeast, or indeed works around Bangor and down to Carnarvon, and that is different to what works in rural hinterland then. And then secondly, I think there is very often a bit of rose-tinted glasses looking at rural transport. Rural transport has never been good. You know, I got family who are from and still live in rural Monmouthshire. And I remember I used to hate going there for holidays. There was a bus twice a week, Wednesdays and Saturdays, and that was it. And it took you in the morning into the local market town, and then it dumped you there, and you were left there all day till you came home. They then had the post buses, but then they went, so they've got nothing in the area. They had nothing in the area. And now, I mean, I'm not saying it's wonderful. Now they get 4 buses a day now. When you compare it to 2 buses a week, 4 buses a day is, to use of Good Valley's expression, 4 buses a week is God's pocket. So I think there is a bit of a rose-tinted of the things were much better than in fact they are. And I don't think that is the case, really. I mean, what Christine says is a good point, actually, that we need to encourage active travel there. I mean, it's ripe for it, I think, particularly with e-bikes for decrepit people like me going up hills and that. No, I think rural transport is obviously very different to urban transport. It's stated in the obvious, but I think it's often overlooked.
We've talked about the rural aspect for buses there, and John, you've touched on the urban side of it. Do you think buses really feature strongly enough in Welsh government in recent times? And do you expect whoever the next administration is to have a new approach or a different approach on buses in all parts of Wales?
Well, I think the die is cast, isn't it? Because the current administration, and I think being realistic, and my Tory friends won't like this, I think the chances of them forming a government are not very great. But I think the die has been cast with the buses bill that did fall. As we know, the government have made it obvious they want to resurrect it. They are doing things now, which I'm not party of because I'm delightfully retired now. But you know, there are schemes now to continue support for the bus industry in return for greater support, and the bus industry has to embrace change. I think I would say, I always use again Pontypridd as the example, and I think wearing a non-bus person's hat, I don't care who runs the buses, basically, as long as they turn up, are reliable and are decent, and if I were paying a fare and the fares weren't too much then. But I mean, up until about 1985 or so, there were 2 buses an hour from Pontypridd to Cardiff. There are now, is it 10 an hour? I'm not sure. And even in the evening, there are 2 an hour. So I think things are better. I mean, they are far from perfect, and the bus industry, it must embrace change and try and form a partnership, I think, with the government and with local government, and with a big ear listening to what other aspects of public transport want, the users and the other stakeholders, such as active travel, that have come to the forefront in more recent years.
Christine, we had Victoria Winkler on last week, and a few years ago she wrote a paper which was talking about free bus transport in Wales, which would cost around 50 million per annum. Do you see something like that in the next administration or later this decade?
In honesty, no, I can't see that. I mean, it would be great, wouldn't it? You know, if we could have free transport for people, or people that need it, that would be fantastic. I can't see that. I think there are questions around the financial sustainability of the services that we currently have. Some communities, you know, would be lucky just to have a bus that they could pay for. So brilliant. If we can have free transport for all, fantastic. But I can't see that.
I think the financial constraint is certainly there. There isn't enough money floating around in government at the moment, and isn't likely to be for some time. What the government has done, as John suggested, it has financed the bus companies through thin rather than thick over the last few months. And they have to realise that without that money, where the government has been paying pretty well all its concessionary fares pass income and also its BSS3 bus grant in full to the companies, so that there would be companies there at the end of this pandemic. Because if you look at the number of buses that float around Wales with nobody on them, and what we've got is this loss of income through the fare box, through the actual paying customer. Now, 50% of costs, 50% of revenue is from over 60s bus passes and from direct grants. So there's another 50% to be found if we were to get anywhere near free travel. It's been tried in a few places. In Estonia, they introduced about six years ago the free travel in Tallinn, the capital, and then introduced it in the whole of Estonia on the buses and then onto the trains for citizens of Estonia to enable them to move around. The uptake was actually quite small, but you might say the thing about Estonia was it had come out from the Soviet Union where everybody was poor, except the Politburo, but everybody else was poor. And those people therefore wanted cars. They saw the West had cars. And so that influence made them go out and buy cars. So it's a slightly different situation to the one we have here, where a large proportion of families do have cars. I think, though, what people are looking for in public transport and in all the surveys done over the last few years, it's not so much the price, although that's clearly a factor. It's much more to do with frequency, with reliability, with predictable journey time. And for that, governments need to seriously look at bus lanes. Not start as one major city in Wales, that I will not mention the name of, but wasn't Cardiff, will in fact started to take away the bus lanes. Now, that's not happened anymore, and clearly the Welsh Government wasn't terribly happy with that kind of move. So we do have the large free travel element in Welsh buses with the over 60s bus pass and cheaper fares provided for example, by My Bus tickets and other commercial facilities moving onto the railways. So it's those key factors of frequency, reliability and predictable journey time and the journey time itself that people are looking for. I was told by a managing director of one of the biggest companies in Wales that runs services between Pontypridd and the top end of the valleys down to Cardiff, that he had buses with space on them, and yet people were getting onto the trains, 40-year-old trains, packed like sardines, coming down valley lines, because they could more or less predict the journey time on the train, but not on the bus. We have got to get over that if the bus is going to come back as an attractive proposition instead of the car. But if we relate that back to rural areas, rural transport has improved. And as John was saying, there were times when there was a bus every 2 hours or every 2 days. And that certainly was the case in the area between Carmarthen and Aberystwyth. Totally rural, lots of small villages, Lampeter and Aberaeron being the only two big towns. In that area, because Sustrans Cymru introduced its T1 service every hour, every day, then the feeder buses like Bookabus and the other feeder buses like community transport feeding into those key routes enabled people to make, instead of having a choice twice a week, they now had 12 choices a day in each direction to make that journey by bus. Now, that's what's pushed up the demand for bus transport in that area. And I think that's the kind of repetition we see in other areas, and we need to ensure that that becomes ingrained in the government's bus policy. But I think it is true to say the railways always were the biggie. That was the thing. That was the darling of governments. That was what they wanted to put lots of money into. The bus companies always came second somehow. And I think there's a realization now that in government that buses have a major role to play. And I think we've got to push that forward on the unfortunate advantage that's been gained from COVID, that the government has kept these companies going, because otherwise they would undoubtedly have gone out of business.
Stuart, you mentioned the time it takes to get down from the tops of the valleys to Cardiff. Until the politicians, I know Christina sat alongside me in the committee when they've been looking at things, and they've had the wagging finger off me when I said, until you lot, whoever you are, all your parties, until all of you will grasp the problem of congestion, the problem of car is king, and that is the trouble. Car is king, and they're afraid of that the car lobby will vote against them. Until the politicians grasp that, people will not get on the bus. And the parallel that Stuart drew quite properly was that people would rather get on crap trains, jam-packed, and very often you can't get on. They would, and there's plenty of room on buses, and the buses are good, they are modern, they are more comfortable than the blooming those awful trains that they've had to use here. Until the route through, the path through to Cardiff with bus priority, so people are parked on the A470, stuck in their car, and the buses fly past on dedicated bus lanes, people are not going to make the modal shift. Some wagging finger for the politicians who haven't got the guts to carry out what they say.
Christine, when we asked you about buses, you seemed trepidatious that free transport could happen. But when you ask a lot of Welsh people about metros, whether that be South Wales or North Wales, they have that same trepidation that a metro could happen. Do you think they've got a justified in feeling that way, that no matter what any government of any colour says, there's not going to be any big infrastructure projects built?
The metro is coming. I know James Price at Transport for Wales is very confident about that. That will happen. And I really think priorities have to change. Like I say, look at what's happening with our environment. And we're at a point now, aren't we, where we can make a decision to do something different. We're all working differently. The way we travel has changed. So many more people, are walking and cycling from home to get to the things they need. We can make some bold decisions right now, and that is what needs to happen. We need to see the next Welsh government, making bold decisions that reflect the urgency of the climate crisis that we are in. Because these things are not going away. And as John quite rightly says, we've designed our society around the car. We've been doing that for decades. We've built things that people can't get to. We've destroyed our town centres already, and COVID has just kind of put the final nail in the coffin, hasn't it? We need to make sure that, we are bringing things back to places that are accessible and making sure that the links around them are suitable for people to use, so that our town centres are easy to get to and that they're nice places to be. There's a lot of work to do, but I think it's more than possible. I think we need to make sure that everybody has access to the things they need close to home. And I think there's a very serious danger right now that we are going to create greater transport inequality, a wider transport gap, because we're at a point where, we're promoting the electric car. So, there's a consultation now on a strategy for electric vehicle charging. There's no strategy for active travel. What message does that send out? We've got to change our priorities. If we put all this focus on the electric car, firstly, it's not zero environmental impact. It still has a negative environmental impact. It still will create more congestion. There are growth plans for all local authorities. Cardiff alone has got 40,000 new homes planned. We're only going to have more cars on the road, and we will make transport unaffordable for more people. Electric cars will be out of the price range of lots of people. And then if we make, public transport more unpopular, if there are fewer people using it, I can see the prices of that going up. We've just had an announcement about rail fare increase again. We make transport unaffordable for many. And then, the issue with that is that you have people then that can't access jobs and services. They can't have, the same quality of life that other people can have. And we've seen that very clearly in the last 12 months. You know, there was a situation where if you had a car, you could go to the beach, you could go to the hairdressers, you could go out for lunch. If you didn't have a car, you were stuck at home, you know, and that is reality for lots of people. There was one quote when I worked at the Community Transport Association, somebody called their home the most beautiful prison in the world, because ultimately, if you don't have access to transport, that is what your home becomes. You know, you can't go anywhere. And I think so many of us, when you have transport, you take it for granted, you know, and it seems like it's a means to an end. It's something that gets you from A to B, but it isn't that. It's much more than that. You know, mobility is a sense of freedom and independence. It is essential for experiencing and enjoying everyday life. So I think we have to think about how we're planning our communities. You know, I really hope that our local economies are going to thrive now with more people at home and potentially working local in the future. I think we have to design our communities. You know, any new housing developments has to prioritise active travel. You have to have bike parking. You've got to connect to the cycle network. You know, this is an injustice for people if this doesn't happen. So yeah, you know, there's lots of work to do, you know, linking up with public transport, and we have to make sure these decisions start happening, you know, over the coming years, or we're going to have a very serious problem on our hands in terms of social exclusion.
One of the big arguments that was made with regards to nationalisation of the railways by the Labour Party in the last few years is that it would bring down the cost of rail for people. Now we see a nationalised railway in Wales. The first question I want to ask is, do you think this is the right thing to do? And secondly, what do you think the future of our rail network is? Do you think it will stay nationalised, or do you see it being put out back to tender?
First of all, let's look at the fare comparisons. The Welsh Government fares policy on the railways is a low fares policy. To commute from Aberdare to the centre of Cardiff is just over 30 miles, and the cost is about £1,200 for an annual season ticket. From a similar distanced commuter town into London, the cost is £3,500 to £4,000. That's a clear policy by the Welsh Government to pursue a low-cost provision of train services, and that was even when there were private companies like Hiraeth and Keolis Amy running the service. The Welsh Government's objective has clearly been for quite some time. It was probably most clearly set out by Edwina Hart, the previous Transport Minister. She undoubtedly wanted to nationalise the railways. Unfortunately, it wasn't possible for her to do that from the government's point of view. I don't think it has to be nationalised as such. What we have at the moment is what's called the operator of last resort. The principles for running the railway are exactly the same because they're included in a UK Act of Parliament. There has to be a company which runs the railway. It can't be run by a government department, although, oddly enough, Network Rail is wholly owned by the Department for Transport and then presumably is some kind of government department. But there has to be this structure of franchising. Now, whether you do that through a publicly owned company or a privately owned company, I think the impact is the objective. The objective of a private company has to be profitability. It can't exist otherwise. The objective of a state-owned company can be whatever ministers want it to be. They can have it to make profits. They can have it to break even. They can have it to make profits to reinvest. That's a decision, but it is entirely internally within the rail operation and within governmental operations. I think the opportunity we've got in having a state-owned company running the railway on behalf of the government is that we ought to be able to get bus rail integration far better than we've ever done before. It's not guaranteed. London Transport never managed to integrate the buses and the trains, but they didn't really need to, except in the outlying areas, because there were so many buses and so many trains that you waited 5 minutes and something would turn up. What we have now, and what we haven't had for a long time, is bus companies and train companies working together. Now, if the government has its mind on using the COVID position, unfortunately, It was the thing that brought it to a head, where the bus companies are so dependent on government. Their objections, which is one of the reasons that pulled down the bus services bill, which John referred to, was the opposition by the big bus companies to doing that. And that opposition, I think, put off civil servants advising ministers to push for integration, and indeed maybe make integration a condition of providing all the funding they have done and all the funding they used to do even pre-COVID in terms of the various kinds of subsidies. Now, that I think is an opportunity. It would be almost a disgrace, but it would certainly be unacceptable if the government wasn't able to do what everybody wants it to do, which is to get the buses to meet the trains, so that you don't have to wait ages for a connecting bus or a connecting train, because nobody's bothered to put the timetables together. And when we're about it, let's put the tickets together as well, so that we have a London-style Oyster card, and you can travel either in local areas in Wales. You have maybe your Southwest Wales Oyster card, you have your Southeast, Cardiff, Newport Valley's Oyster card, or you have a whole Wales Oyster card. But the one thing about an Oyster card is, or that kind of card, it's stored value. So you don't need to have individual kinds of passes of that sort. You have one pass, and the charges being made will reflect themselves on the amount of money you've got left on your card. The government very kindly, I have to say, sent me to the Netherlands for a week some years ago. Thank you very much. And my time there was spent on work I'd done there before. Their system is very straightforward. All fares are controlled by a government agency, either local or national. But the tickets that every bus company and every train company, and they do have a degree of franchising as we do, they are all required under the terms of their contract to accept the chip and carte, which is a stored value card, and you can use it on buses, trams, to hire bicycles, to travel on the trains and the trolleybuses locally. Some of those infrastructure, well, the infrastructure is all owned by Nedrail, the state-owned train company like Network Rail. The services, long-distance services, are run by Nederland Railway, which is the long-distance services, which is the old Dutch railway system. Local services are franchised by the province, and that province then decides on the fares. But the tickets have to be accepted. There's no question of it. And then secondly, to go back to, I think, one of Christine's main points was how you provide for cyclists, walkers, and transport. In most Netherlands towns, if you take a town like Utrecht, same size as Cardiff, every road of any note into the centre of that city has a space for pedestrians, a space for cyclists, and a space for buses. And if you're lucky, a space for cars. But let's push the cars behind. Let's get room for those key things first, which means if you can't get in there, then you're going to use one of those means of transport. And you know that the cycleway is safe. You know that the pavement is safe because you haven't got cyclists on the pavement. And although Lee Waters told me something amazing once, that it's the only safe place to ride a bicycle is on the pavement, I think that's when Lee was at Sustrans, that's not acceptable. You know, you've got to have provision for people to cycle, to walk, or to go by public transport.
Christine, Stuart just mentioned some of the kind of key features in notable places where active travel is really at the forefront. How do you think Wales gets there?
You know, we need to see a shift in funding priorities, to make active travel more viable. So at the minute, 62% of the capital transport budget is still being spent on building new roads, and we need to see that change. You know, there is an indication that new roads are not the priority, but we need some serious commitment to that. And then, you know, from what we could save from building new roads, you know, we need to ensure that there's more invested into active travel. So at Sustrans, we'd like to see a minimum of 10% of the total transport budget spent on active travel. we need to make sure that there's a revenue stream for behaviour change, because it's not enough just to create the active travel routes. You need to encourage people to use them and, you know, support them in skills, build their confidence, you know, show them the routes and help them to access that. And then, you know, in addition to that, we're calling for a £20 million capital fund for the development and improvement of the national cycle network. We need that to be seen as a strategic part of the network and making sure they are integrated into the wider transport network. And we need to see them as a national asset, recognising that they benefit health, allow people to make safe and healthy journeys. You know, they're creating, you know, they're ensuring people can remain well, you know, and that's really important. So yeah, more investment into active travel in the round, and then targets for modal shift. You know, we need this to happen. We need the government to take it seriously, and we need to make sure there are clear targets and that there's monitoring being carried out to, you know, make sure we're on track to make the progress that we need.
What I think we need to take away is free parking and all this sort of thing. That I'm delighted to say I was on the working group bringing in now the recommendations of no parking on pavements. You know, I'm always haranguing people out here and in my nose in peril when I'm going on and people parking on the pavement. But I think you need all of these things, a combination of things have improved. Let's give the credit to governments, and you know, I'm sure this was happening before devolution even, where, you know, we all know of 60s and 70s developments where there was no thought of buses or active travel. Active travel has come along a lot later still. I mean, there are estates where buses can't get through. You can't have a bus there because the bus can't turn around at the bottom end. It is better because now the planning aspect of provision is required to take account of the need for access, and I think active travel needs to be included in that, so that there are ways that buses, cyclists, pedestrians can get from wherever the developments are. It is a bit better now. You know, I was thinking as we've been talking, a lot of the estates and that from the, certainly in the valleys and that, a lot of these estates that were developed in the 60s and 70s are up on the side of mountains, because down below it was a bit, I'm trying to think of a polite word, it wasn't the best place to live then. They're better now, and there are far more developments on the valley floor, so there's no excuse now for provision to be made. And I think that the planning functions need to be a part of the public transport, needs to be a significant part of the planning function, and planning, road planning, and that needs to be part of whether it's TFW or needs to be far more, that needs to be integrated as well. I think that's a long-winded answer, but I think I was saying, yes, we need all of these things. And I think we still need cars. Let's not, you know, mount a campaign against them. Of course you need cars, but people don't seem to think, oh, I can't use public transport to go into Cardiff because the bus stop or the train station is 2 miles away. Well, it doesn't mean you've got to use public transport from your front door, get to the bridging point, and then, you know, either get on the bus or the train there, as long as there are facilities to park or to leave your bike chained up or whatever.
We also need to have the removal of barriers on the national cycle network, because there are lots of access barriers, you know, protecting the routes to try to discourage dirt bikes and things like that. But what it actually achieves is that, you know, people with disabilities who are using a trike or an adapted cycle, or even, you know, people with prams can't get through at times. And I think that would be a really positive thing to make sure that active travel is inclusive for everybody, to remove those barriers so all people can use it.
I've got one more area. Like, we've talked a lot about buses, rail, active travel, and government money is essential in all of these. And one of the areas we haven't touched is, of course, air transport, and Welsh Government are very crucial in that, owning the airport. Where do you see our air policy going in the next administration?
The Welsh Government, of course, don't have responsibility for most of air policy. I mentioned a couple of areas in the public transport, land public transport, if you like, But the Welsh Government's only involvement at the moment is owning the airport and providing, as they are now, looking at a new road link into the airport. And of course, Sustrans Cymru provide the bus link to Cardiff Airport. The Welsh Government have asked time and time again to have air passenger duty transferred to them. It provides a source of revenue, but it also means they can determine what the cost of flying from Cardiff Airport will be, compared with probably our biggest competitor is Bristol, and our next competitor to Cardiff Airport is Heathrow. Now, if there were lower passenger duty rates in Wales, of course, people would, because of price, maybe start to move over. But Bristol Airport, of course, won't have it. And they are undoubtedly sitting outside the Minister of Transport for Air in Whitehall every day, muttering to him or her as they go past, you can't give the Welsh this responsibility because all they'll do is pinch our passengers. Well, I thought we were all in a competitive market and we should perhaps be doing that. But other than that, very little else. For example, the First Minister was on television recently being interviewed about international travel. Well, the Welsh Government can't do anything about international travel in and out of Cardiff Airport. The only answer that Mark Drakewood was able to give was, we don't have any flights at the moment. But that decision is entirely made by the UK government. So very few kind of levers that the Welsh Government can currently use, other than, as they have done, maintain Cardiff Airport as a viable proposition, if with government support.
Although Welsh policy boards have been talking about devolving APD for a long time, is there no concern about what potential environmental impact that would have if we were to suddenly have a huge influx of air travel to Wales?
Yeah, obviously, you know, Sustrans is very much about sustainability and reducing carbon footprint. And so, yeah, you know, air travel wouldn't be something that we're particularly desperately keen to support.
As this is a podcast about what we're sort of expecting to see at the election, I'm going to ask you two questions wrapped into one. What are you expecting in terms of big headline transport policies to be proffered at the Senedd election, and what do you think the result will be? So we'll start with John.
Well, I think I've sort of referred to it. I think looking forward realistically, if you like, to who's going to come into power, I think it is likely to be some sort of a left-centre type administration, however that is made up then. So I think we're about to see, well, in fact, I think there is a commitment given, isn't there, to the resurrection of the bus services bill. I think the direct result of that is going to be that the government is going to have more control in some way or other over bus services here. I think what the bus industry would put forward, the idea of always need to work in partnership. I think partnership is the way forward. However that is achieved, it can't be done by just one dominant partner or one partner taking everything over. It's a partnership of government, local government, bus operators and other key stakeholders such as bus users, active travel users and travel information providers.
To some extent, I agree with John that what we're likely to have is either a Labour slightly minority or a Labour Plaid Cymru government. That's the most likely, unless of course Andrew R.T. Davies becomes amazingly left of centre, which is pretty unlikely. So I think we are likely to be left with either of those two options or that combination. In terms of buses, competitive franchising, I think, has to be the way forward. It's been something that's been talked about for the last 30 years, and it's not a difficult thing to do when 50% of the income of bus companies comes from the government anyway, in the form of various grants, without which many of the routes couldn't exist. Some routes will still be commercial, and the companies run them in that way. But then that profit is kept by the companies rather than be fed into a degree of cross-subsidising. We also have to have integrated ticketing and integrated fares for all bus operations, particularly where there are two companies on the same route, and customers can only use one bus company if they buy their ticket in the morning and can't use maybe another bus company that uses a subsidised, operates a subsidised service in the evening. In terms of the railway, as I said earlier, I think the Welsh Government always wanted to nationalise the railway in some way. And they've got the best they can get at the moment from the existing legislation. Plaid Cymru would be of the same persuasion. That being the case, I think they will try to hang on to being operator of last resort. And what it appears they're going to do is to change that operation to such an extent that it would be impossible for a private company to bid for it, because its objectives would have become social, economic and environmental rather than purely economic and financial. And I think that's a major change that we might find coming. In terms of running the buses, TfW seem at the moment to want to run the buses from Cardiff everywhere. That's a non-starter. If they do it, I go back to John's word about partnership. The partnership of local authorities or consortia, as we had before, of local authorities where that fits in nicely to the journey to work pattern, that and TfW, where TfW running the railways and Stustrans Cymru as national operations, and the local authorities with Welsh Government funding from the bottom up running the bus services, but making sure they all interconnect. That's what people want. Easy travel, frequent, and as I said earlier, reliable. It's that ease of travel. EasyJet have got the word right. Make it easy bus, easy rail, and people will start going back to it as they've done to EasyJet.
I think that, all manifestos are going to be heavy on COVID response and green recovery. I think all will support a Clean Air Act. I think that's, quite critical, and I can't see, any feeling that doesn't need to happen. I think there also could be, or is likely to be, a focus on revitalising town centres, and how we do that is going to be important. So, for us, that is about ensuring they're easy to get to, that people can travel there actively, and that they are connected by sustainable transport, and then of course that they are nice spaces that people want to be in. Then what do I think the outcome? I think this is going to be a really interesting election. Of course we've got 16, 17-year-old votes, we've got is it EU nationals able to vote, so we've got a higher group of people who can cast their vote this time. I think the parties are standing for some quite clear and different issues. Plaid are very strong on independence, of course. Others kind of taking different views on COVID response and things like that. So I think people are going to be able to make a clear choice. What do I think is going to happen? I think Labour minority or Labour Lib Dem coalition.
Ooh, we haven't had that one for a while. Thank you very much to all of you for coming on this evening. If people want to get hold of you, whether sort of Twitter or email, what's the best way to do so? Christine?
I'm at Mrs. C Boston.
Thank you very much. John?
I am, surprisingly enough, at John Pockett with 2 T's.
Thank you very much. And Stuart?
Yeah, using my I still have a bardic name, stuartdelfryn at AOL.com.
Wonderful. Thank you all so very much for appearing on the show with us this evening. If you've enjoyed what you've heard, please don't forget to find us on Medium at HiraethBlogCymru, on Facebook at HiraethBlogCymru, and on Twitter at HiraethBlog. Thank you for listening to Hiraeth. If you like what you heard, please don't forget to subscribe, rate and review.